Welcome to the Elokus podcast. This is class number 14 in the first discourse of this book, Besha'ah Shehikdimu, the first Maamor we're learning over here of the discourse Besha'ah Shehikdimu in 5672. The first discourse in all its classes was dedicated L'Schus, a Refuah Sheleimo for Avraham Ben Parvin, amongst all the ill of the Jewish people. May he have a complete recovery and blessings for his entire mishpacha, family. Yesterday's recording, I was told, and then I listened, saw that it was not clear. I think there's always a few obstacles over here to make things work well. But Baruch Hashem, I think today we should have a clear recording with God's help. Okay, we are now going to we completed yesterday, chapter 2. We're going to do the Kitzer, as I mentioned to you earlier, that Baruch Hashem, the Rebbe Rashab, the author of the book, Fifth Chabad Rebbe, wrote a summary at the conclusion of every chapter, so it helps us summarize and keep focused. And here we go, Kitzer. So I'm going to read his summary. Yaschel Levar, he begins to explain a hefresh, the difference between Keser l'Sharei Asfiris, between Keser and the rest of the spheres. Remember, we began talking about that the Jews were given crowns, started speaking about the whole concept of crowns, and then he says, what is the inyan of Keser? So we learned that Keser is a medium. It's the will that's in the first chapter, the medium between a person and everything that will follow. There's always a will that first encompasses everything that's going to follow. But here he begins to explain how that energy of Keser is transcendent and different than the other spheres, the other attributes and other expressions of the Ein Sof. Because the other ones are internalized and Keser is an makif, an encompassing energy. So over here, he's not explaining Keser yet. He's explaining how the other spheres are makifim. Are pnimium, are internal energies. V'yavar hamashal benefesh. Now, by the way, just for you to know, that this explanation of the orpnimi, of the internal light, by the time we get back to Keser, it's going to be far, far, far. I'm learning on my own a little bit ahead, quite a bit ahead. I just finished chapter 30, which in chapter 30, he actually concludes something that we're beginning now in chapter 3. They're showing you the vastness of this, that we have to learn 30 chapters, which is probably going to be a few months from now, until we even just conclude this one idea that he's beginning to explain in this chapter, how Pnimi works, how internal light works. As we mentioned in the beginning, that when we're signing up for this course, for this learning, this is a long haul. Baruch Hashem. In any case, and again, I just learned the conclusion of the Pnimi in chapter 30. I don't even know when he's going to go back into Keser, into the transcendental light, because he's still taking his time and further exploring that. But Be'ezus Hashem will get there. But in any case, so v'yavar hamashal benefesh, he starts explaining the mashal, because the analogy in a human soul, shekol hakoyches, because all the powers are bereisham, and most significant, koach haseichel, the power of the intelligence, hem koyches pnimiyim, their internal powers. That means they are mislabish, they enclose themselves in a vessel. And because they're meant to go into a vessel, internalize in a vessel, for that reason, the vessel needs to be compatible with the light. The yaskir biktsara, and that's what we explained. Remember, the eye is meant for vision. The ears are made in a way, they perform the form of the ear that it takes in sound. And God's infinite wisdom. The brain is meant, it's a different type of material, and it's meant to be able to receive. And the last words we learned actually where I did this fast yesterday in the end of chapter 1 is that he said those words, chomer hamoyach, just going back to the end of chapter 2, the substance, the chomer, the material of the mind, of the brain, valachluchis hadakei shaboy, and has a very, very fine moisture, certain wetness, which is a more refined, in other words, it makes the substance of the brain more of a very fine material. Yesh by eze dugma, it is formed in a way that it is similar. The physical dynamics of it is similar miteva oir haseichel, similar to the spiritual dynamics of the energy of intelligence. That energy of intelligence also has a certain moisture, spiritual moisture and wetness, which obviously is not the place for it to go right now. How intelligence has, and I'll say one word, intelligence is more watery than fiery, because in intelligence there is calmness, and water represents calmness, and it flows downward, it reveals itself, as opposed to emotions, for instance, are fire, passion. They rise upward and they're restless, and a person that's very emotional is very not calm. So is excited, right? So you see, the brain is meant, it's wet. The heart is made of a different type of a material, full of blood, full of the material of the heart. The physical material of the heart is meant to facilitate emotions. The physical material of the brain is meant to facilitate the mind. V'yasker b'ktsara, now he says in parentheses, and he mentions in the chapter 2, he's referring to himself, but he says v'yasker as if he's speaking about a third person. V'yasker b'ktsara, and he mentions briefly, inyan islapshus haseichel ba'koicha shelamat mimenu. If you remember in chapter 2 in the beginning, we were also speaking, in addition to the kochos, the powers, each one finding its matching limb, he also was discussing it, that the kochos are discriminatory when they enclose themselves in the lower power. Sometimes there's one power vesting itself in a lower power, but but even then, it does it in gradual way. The intelligence that goes into the emotions is a deeper level of intelligence than the intelligence that goes into the hands, into the movement. And we're going to see later that the intelligence that goes into the hands is a higher level of intelligence than the intelligence that moves into the power of movement that's in the legs. A person can have intelligent movement in the legs, but it's not as fine, it's not as intelligent, it's not as refined as the intelligence of the arms, of the hands. So you see it, because everything works in its appropriate vessel. Even when the kochos go into one koach going into another koach, which is not really oiros bekelim, it's light in lights, it's not lights in vessels. But since we're talking about an or panimi, an internal light, even when it goes into another or, it's selective and it works with an appropriate, in that sense, the lower or, the lower energy is going to become a vessel for the higher energy, and it has to be picky in selective, it has to be appropriate. And then we also learned, this is the reason, this is the reason why the limbs cause the powers to become coarsened. So we learned all the powers of the soul, when they're in the soul, they're in a higher state, more spiritual. Once they go into the body, the body has an impact on them, an effect on them, in lowering them down, because they become so deeply intertwined, they become so deeply assimilated one with each other. But on the other hand, the limbs, although they add their imprint on the powers, but at the same time, in order for them to be recipients of the energies, they have to surrender completely to the energies. And the powers direct and govern over the limbs. But the way it governs is not in a way that it overpowers b'koach. It doesn't compel the limbs, but rather it reveals itself in the limbs, because the limbs are totally open and surrendered to the input of the energy. And as a result of that, the limbs are uplifted. It goes internalized. Behizgalos, the energy reveals itself into the limbs. Not in a compulsory manner, not in a forceful way. And the final point we learned, the way the kochos themselves will reveal themselves. Earlier we spoke in general, each koach has its limb, and that it reveals itself. But here he's going to say that the nature of the limbs, this was the point of yesterday's class, the nature and the chemistry of every individual organ, the way it is different by every person, because based on, as we discussed yesterday, based on our parents, our genes, our organs are formulated differently. You can have a different type of an eye. Not everybody has the same eye, physical eye. As we said, some eyes have more blood, and other eyes have less, more the black and the white, and you see the coloring of the eye. All of this, which is the substance, the material of the limbs, has an impact on the nature of the light, because the oil will settle into the vessel, respecting the character of the vessel, and therefore we learned yesterday something amazing, that even people's ability to have a good eye or a negative eye, to see things positively or negatively, a lot has to do with the physical chemistry of the eye itself. Is according to the well balanced mix of what goes into to making the physical substance of the limbs, that can be variable. Just like we don't have the same blood type, the nature, our skin colors are different. All these, there are no two cells, two people the same, exactly the same. We're all different, and based on our organs and limbs, that will determine the nature of our soul powers as well, because they become so unified with the limbs. That's the point. Now we begin chapter 3. However, this is going very deep. The main point over here is, now this line that he's going to say right now is going to be the subject matter for the next 30 chapters, which is going to be the next like 5-6 discourses, maybe more. The reason why the energies of the soul become so, these powers become so embedded and so unified with their kalim, with their vessels, it's because the powers are essentially, in other words, if we go back to their essence, they are meant from the very get-go, from their very origins in the soul itself. We're going to see the powers of the soul originate in the soul itself, in the very soul itself. Yet, in their very origination point, they are meant to be energies that are going to settle in vessels. The soul itself, as we're going to see, is really unvesselable. The soul itself is really, on its essence, is infinite and beyond containment in a vessel. However, it possesses powers. The soul possesses powers, which those powers are originally carved out, if you might say, into the soul to be containable into containers. And that's what makes these powers, from their very, very origins of origins, that they are lend themselves to be able to enter into a vessel. The koichos are essentially pnimiyim, internalized powers, which means if they're meant to go into a vessel, means they come in a manner of limitation. Because the idea of going into a vessel is that the vessel contains, and it can't contain something that is limitless. So therefore, it comes in a way of hagbala min hanefesh, from the soul. So even way before it comes into a vessel, it's already a restrained power. And for that reason, they are comparable to the vessels. In other words, they are in a state where they could be lower down into a vessel. In other words, we say something like this: had the kochos of the nefesh not been kochos, but rather we might say like this: the soul, there is the soul. The soul is a non-identifiable entity. It's a pure energy that's for all practical purpose infinite, meaning not defined by, it's not green, it's not yellow, it's not orange, it's not smart, it's not kind, it's not tall, it's not short. It's an abstract essence of something, right? We know that the godly soul is a piece of Hashem, which is undefinable and unknowable. But even any human soul, the essence of the spirit is not this or not that. Fine. Now, if that soul would emanate energy, which is a ray, it would just shine light, which means it would project of its power. That projection of that power, we always know there is a rule, or me'ein ha'ma'or. The light is always similar to its source. So if the soul, which is simple and non-defined, would emanate just pure infinite energy, infinite light, although it's only a ray, but it would be similar to its source, then, and we were then to say that that simple light coming from the nefesh, coming from the soul, goes into the body, And because the body has different systems, the body has a brain, and the body has a heart, and the body has a liver, and the body has a digestive tract, the stomach and the like, and the body has hands and feet and eyes and ears and nose. We would say that the simple energy of the soul, as it flows into the body, each limb does with that energy what that limb is meant to do. So the brain would grab that simple energy and turn it into intelligence. The eyes will grab that energy and turn it into sight. The ears would grab that very same energy and turn it into sound, into hearing, and so forth, each limb and each organ. We might think so. So he's saying over here, it's absolutely not that way. The powers that go into the soul originate in the soul as specific powers. It's not just a simple energy of the soul that goes in and just, it's not like the power. Let's talk about electricity. When you have an office and you have a bunch, you have a power strip. And to that power strip, you have a printer connected to it. You have a telephone connected to it. You have a computer connected to it, which includes the computer and the monitor. You might have, what else? I don't know, some other machine that is connected to it. So you have like 5, 6 different machines. No one is going to argue that in the power source, which is inside the main power line of the home, there is, phone power, and there is printer power, and there is fax power, and there is monitor power, screen power. Everybody realizes, because realize the same. If you pull this power out and you stick in a toaster, or you stick in a refrigerator, or an air condition, it's going to do this. It's not going to be any difference, because the power source doesn't have particular powers. It's just one simple power, and that power just gives power. So the power that's going to the monitor is equal to the power that's going to the phone. So we would think that the soul with the body is the same thing. It's just an energy that flows, and the differences are in the recipient, in the vessels. Here he's saying it's not that way. The powers that, there is such a power. That's the power of life that flows in the body. Yes, the fact that your entire body is alive, that's equal in all the limbs. But we're talking about the fact that there is intelligence, vision, hearing, sound, digestion, the ability of movement, the motor powers of the hands and the feet, and so on and the like. They are not the same energy. These are unique kochos of the nefesh. And the reason why each one is able to go into a vessel, into a container, is because essentially the soul has within itself designated powers, which is a very big chiddush. It's a hard thing to imagine. Then the soul would seem like it's made up of a bunch of pieces. The soul in its essence has a power of sight and a power of, we're saying it does, but then the soul would be then a composite. And we know the soul can't be a composite. So we're going to have to juggle this as we learn. But first of all, he's stating the fact, and this is the truth. The soul has powers, and those powers then go into the body, and each power finds its chavrusa. It finds its perfect match that it can get married to and unify with. Look what he's saying. These are powers that come from the nefesh. And these powers are be'erech. They are compatible to go into vessels. Now he says in the parentheses. Let's skip the parentheses for a minute so that we can finish this thought, and we'll come back to the parentheses. And even though the soul itself is not limited, so the soul is an abstract force that's not limited, and nevertheless, the kochos that the soul carries within it are in a state of limitation. The very notion that they are specific powers, that means there's already a design to them. It's not limitless, because a limitless power, or something that's limitless, has no form and shape whatsoever. If we say about something that it is wisdom, it is kindness, it is compassion, it is might, or whatever, all the other spheros and attributes and powers that we have, or emotions versus intelligence, and so that's already a definition. That's already something specific. The nefesh itself is beli gvul, but it does carry kochos. There is a koach of chachma in the nefesh, in the soul. There is koach chesed. There is a power of kindness. Vehein nimtzayim, and they are to be found klulim benefesh. They are included in the soul. Loi shehen ha'ara v'hispashtus ma'nefesh atzmai, but they are not the soul itself expressing itself. This is a very, very fine line over here. So let's try to understand this. And this is what I touched upon before. The soul itself is not a composite of a bunch of pieces. The soul is an etzem echad mufshit mikol with perfect hafshata. What that means is the soul is simple, removed from any kind of definition, specification, characterization, personality. The soul is a force, an undefined force. Because it's undefined, it can produce everything because it's simple with utter simplicity, meaning uncharacterized. If the soul would emanate a pure self-reflecting energy, that energy would not be a koach haseichel. It would not be the power of intelligence, the power of chachma, the power of chesed or kindness. That would express itself as a simple power. You know what that is? That's the power of will, as we're going to see soon. Will, which is not a specific koach, and that's why it doesn't go into one particular keli, or it doesn't go into one particular vessel. It governs and controls the entire human system from head to toe. It governs and controls all the kochos, all the powers, and all the limbs. Everything is under the force of will. Will is an emanation of the soul itself. He doesn't say it over here, but I'm putting this in here to understand the distinction. However, the kochos hanefesh that we are talking about are not emanations and just projections of the soul itself. What then? The soul itself has within it, in some very hard way to understand, carries within it kochos, powers, and those powers are one with the soul, but they're not the soul. So they exist and don't exist, kind of. They are specific powers, but when they're in the soul, you don't notice them at all. They're completely drowned in the greater simplistic energy of the soul. But once they emanate as a particular power, and that's the reason why they can go into vessels. Deep stuff. Okay. The chala ara hareyulufi oifena etzem. The reason we cannot say, now he's first explaining, the reason we cannot say that the kochos are the powers, the individual powers, are a reflection of the soul itself, because every reflection is similar to what it is reflecting. Okay? We can tell a light, you can tell very easily on a light in a room what color the source is. If it's yellow, sometimes you have a more whitish light. If you want to do lighting in your house and you're particular, you'll want a softer color, this type, because the light is always a reflection of the source. Moonlight looks different than sunlight, and headlights look different than a lamplight. It's different because the source is different. Therefore, the emanation of the soul itself would be also like the soul, and it wouldn't be particularized. But the kochos, the powers, they're not the radiance of the essence of the soul, but rather, since the nefesh hu hayoisoi bilti mugbal, because the soul is utterly limitless, be'etzem in essence, harehu koilul ba'atzmoi, it includes within itself koichais powers. So this is a cool idea. Since the soul is essentially limitless, if the soul would therefore be stuck in its limitlessness, then it wouldn't really be limitless. Now imagine if the soul would not have these particular powers to emanate. So all the soul would be able to emanate would be pure, simple, undefined energy. And the soul would be almost good for nothing. It couldn't make anything, couldn't affect anything. Right? So part of its limitlessness is that it contains within itself also limited powers. Now, generally, it's interesting because this concept we usually say it about God Himself. That this is a teaching from the Avodas HaKodesh, one of the great Rameir Ben Gabai, great Kabbalist, where he explains he's struggling with the idea of how did sphirot and attributes emanate from a limitless God. So he explains this idea, this kind of the root of what he's saying, that if Hashem would be only limitless and He would not have the power of self-containment and restraint and be able to emanate finite energies, then that itself would be limiting God, because He would be limited in His limitlessness. So He would be too big and He wouldn't be able to be small. So part of God's limitlessness is that He can be tiny and small, that He can emanate small as well. So now He's applying the same concept to the soul, because God created us in His image. So that even that idea also applies to the soul. That due to the limitlessness of the soul also has koichos and powers, which are not the soul itself, but they're included in the neshama, but they are from the very get-go koichos mugbalim, limited powers, although when they're in the soul, they're not limited, but they are boyim bahagbola. They're meant to, when they emerge outward, they will emerge in a limited fashion, and eventually they will go into limbs that will completely encapsulate them and absorb them. As again, the soul includes within itself koichos powers, which are essentially mugbal powers. They are limited powers. Nevertheless, now we're learning a parenthesis. So even though we said that the powers are not the soul itself, and they're not even a pure emanation of the soul, because a pure emanation of the soul would be like the soul. Like we said, will is a pure emanation of the soul. And we're saying only these koichos are like powers in the soul. But he's saying what that means is the nefesh itself carries these kochos. The sham, when they're in the soul, hem b'pchenes achtus mamish. It's amazing. They're there, but when they're in the soul itself, because we can't say the soul is made up of pieces, over there they're in a state of absolute oneness with the soul, that you can't even find these powers. Shanefesh achasi, the soul is one. Gam shenoises akoichos, even though she carries the powers ba'atzma in herself. As stated elsewhere. We're going to have a lot of this abstract talk, Be'ezras Hashem, so don't get excited or worried if you don't understand it perfectly now. But this, that the soul includes the powers in it, this is not the essence of the soul. The essence of the soul is undefinable with any definitions. But yet, the soul itself contains within it these kochos, and they don't interfere with the essence of the soul, because when they're in the essence, they're almost as if they're just one with the essence. But they're really a power that's there. Okay, this is enough to have you pondering for a week, and that's okay. That's what this is all about. We should ponder abstract godliness. We're going to see how all this applies to Hashem as well. We're going to come back to the parentheses tomorrow, and we're still going to chew on this quite a bit to try to understand what he is saying. Meanwhile, let Mashiach be here today.